Now, before you start, putting the tool on the springs and putting this back together, if for whatever reason you remove that bolt and the twin bolt on the other side that runs through this piece of metal here and then through the lower control arm, if you happen to take those out, put those back in before you go compressing the tool, because those are going to be potentially impossible to get back in when everything is under pressure. So I recommend doing this first. If you played around with the sway bar end links, which is why mine got out of whack, loosen those nuts top and bottom as much as you can. You may even have to take them off, because that'll get you more play. There's really not much you can do to convince this sway bar to move very much so that this piece of metal moves. Your best bet is to get all the play and movement out of this piece, because it's got the bushings on there. It's meant to move a little bit, so loosen it up. That's the trick there, and you ought to be able to pry that around just enough to. I put something in between the lower control arm and this washer here. It doesn't take that much force really, and that'll be enough usually to put it in a position. Okay, wanted to pause and show you the setup here. So this is what we've got. Remember, this is the real Jaguar tool and everything. So we've got the first guiding rod or locating pin, whatever you want to call it, in the second position, right? So position, we'll call them position 1, 2, 3 is that little bolt there. In the middle ones, or position 2 there, we've got the locating pins. Okay, those have threads on the end that thread all the way into the lower control arm. There's a little flat bit on the end to make it easier for you to grab a pair of pliers and turn them. So then I've got a long threaded rod here that I started threading early, long before the spring was compressed. So that way the spring pan still has tons of play. You can swing it wherever you want, basically. So I got that one started early. That's the one in the back. Then just a moment ago, I really got all 3 of these pretty much at the same time. Okay, and I used a breaker bar. You can leverage it really anywhere around here on the edge of the spring pan, and then up through the inside of the control arm, so you're leveraging it kind of like this, and just figure out the direction you need to leverage it to get it to go into the holes. And once you're all the way in, pretty easy. Now I'll mention this as you move along, because these back ones there are threaded, they're going to catch a little bit on the hole. So I take a little rubber mallet and just here and there, just kind of tap around. And sometimes it'll just kind of jump up a little bit. Nothing scary. We're talking, fractions of a centimeter, almost nothing really. So
I just want to pause real quick and add something that I didn't mention in this video here. So the official Jaguar method of installing a front spring on the XJS is to use just the locating pins. They don't use threaded rod ever at all. For whatever reason, mine was a little weird in that I really needed to have the 4 different guiding points. I really don't see a downside of this method other than it takes a little bit longer. It's really not bad at all. But the official Jaguar method of doing this is they just use the 2 locating pins and they put those in the innermost position, or the positions where I have the threaded rod. My problem, and I'm not sure why this was the case, is that I simply wasn't able to get the innermost holes of the spring pan to line up or reach those locating pins when they were in the innermost positions. I just couldn't do it, but I was able to get them to go into the middlemost, or the middle positions pretty easily. And so, part of the reason for that is, the lower control arm is at an angle so that the inner portion, or where it connects to the cross member, is higher than the outer portion closest to the brake disc, right, or the wheel hub. And so because of that, the middle positions, when you've got something in there, whether it's threaded rod or the locating pins, they hang lower, meaning that they're going to intersect with the middle holes of the spring pan sooner than if you were to have them in the innermost holes. Now it's got to be compressed more just to reach those pins. So that's why I use that really long, I mean, it might have even been a foot long, I didn't measure it, piece of threaded rod in the back. So I was able to get that one started easily because the spring hadn't even started to compress yet. I could do whatever I wanted with the spring pan. So I'd just kind of stick it in there, I'd go up, and then once it got high enough to reach the middle positions, it was pretty easy to get those in. So just wanted to explain, this is not technically the official way of doing this, but it works, or at least it worked for me.
So the plan here is what I'll do is I'll just keep going basically, and what is eventually going to happen, you can see from the side here, I think, the rear ones are really out of reach of the handle, okay? I don't think I'm going to be able to hit those. The middle ones, however, are going to interfere with the handle. Eventually that handle is going to get higher and higher and higher, and its path will interfere or intersect these middle locating rods. So those are going to have to go. What I'll do is, once I reach a point where those are interfering, then I'll take those out, and I'll go the rest of the way with just those two. And if I really feel like it's necessary, I'll actually replace these locating pins with shorter bits of rod that I'll just cut up. And in case I didn't mention it already, it is the rods need to be, number one, they need to be grade 8 steel. There's different grades, grade 8 or nothing, okay? They are 3/8 by 24. 24 is the number of threads per inch. So it's a very fine thread. It's also called UNF thread. Okay, here you can see we're a little further on. That handle's much higher, the spring is much more compressed, and I have replaced the first of the locating pins with this this bolt here. And of course, it's, again, 3/8 by 24. 24 is the thread pattern, and it is grade 8, of course. And so I think this is a 3-inch bolt, if I remember correctly. So that's in place. About to do the same thing to this threaded rod, because as you'll see, if I'm able to do this with one hand, if I turn this, it's gonna get close to interfering with this guy here pretty soon. So once we get to that point, I will remove that one. Okay, here we go again. I replaced the other locating pin. So now I've got 4 pieces of thread in there, basically, threaded rod. And, like you can see here, you can use bolts if you want to, that's just fine. In fact, that's probably a lot easier. So I'm done with the locating pins at this point. I don't see the advantage over the threaded rod in this particular case, just because, I'm limited to how long those are. And I don't know what I would really gain by replacing those rearmost rods with the locating pins, other than the fact that those don't have threads. So that's one less thing for the spring pan to have, experience resistance against. But like I said earlier, knock it with a rubber mallet here and there, not hard, but enough. And they're just threads, so they'll skip right over the threads if there's some force there. I wanted to point out something here real quick. So this spring pan, if you can kind of see there, it's tilting a little bit to the left, and I don't like that. I don't think anyone would. I'm not sure why, because I've got everything put together just fine, but really, there's that spherical piece. You can just see the underneath of it there, and that's going to allow some movement. So what I like to do at this point is actually thread a nut up those rearward rods there. I can effectively steer the steering pan a little bit if I need to. So in this case, I'm going to thread one up that long one there. It'll take me a minute, but once I get it up there, I can start, using that nut. And you would think that just tightening a nut like that may not move something under so much pressure, but remember, it's just steering it. It's not really supporting but a fraction of the weight. So nothing dangerous there that I can think of.
One last thing here to wrap up the video. I didn't record the very end of this because I felt it was mostly self-explanatory, but I wanted to clarify just a couple things. So obviously what you're going to do at this point, or what I did at least, is continue to tighten the spring compression tool. It's going to raise it up, it's going to raise it up, and then use those nuts on the innermost threaded rods to steer it if you need to. But what you want to be careful of is you don't want to, if you start to steer too much, meaning you tighten one of those nuts too far, it's going to start to bear the load of the spring, and you obviously don't want that, because we're talking about a single nut on a single threaded rod. It doesn't matter how strong the nut and rod are. In this case, that's, you're kind of testing your luck there, I think, if you do that. So you want really all, or at least the vast majority of the load to be on the spring tool, because that's what it's designed for. So what you're going to do is, once you get it up, for me, it was the middle hole closest to the front of the car that I was able to thread an actual bolt in first, like the bolt that actually goes into the spring pan. When you start to thread those bolts back in, you want to make sure that the spring pan is taking on most of the load, or you're going to end up raising the spring pan using those bolts as you tighten them down. So really, when it's all said and done, the tool should be pressing the spring pan up against the bottom of the lower control arm. So those bolts that go in relatively easily. You're not like torquing the heck out of them because you're raising the spring pan with them. That's not the point. You get the spring pan to touch the lower control arm, you thread those bolts in, and then you torque them all down. And make sure you torque them twice just to make sure that everything's good. One other thing I'll mention, and I can't confirm this with certainty, but the original Jaguar bolts that hold in the lower spring pan, those 4 bolts that you see there, had, and I don't know what it's called, but some sort of material on the threads that effectively acts like a Loctite thread sealant or something like that, so it stays in there even better. I noticed that on some of these bolts, when I put them in, I didn't use the original OEM bolts. They were all sufficient in terms of strength, but when I put them in, there was some resistance there, because I think there was probably some residual, whatever you call it, material that was on the old bolts, if that makes sense. So there might have been some thread sealant up in there. You may experience the same thing. I only say that because when you start to get a lot of resistance on something, you get concerns of cross-threading or stripping threads, especially on super fine threads like this. So just keep that in mind, and make sure you grease up everything.